Welcome to Spinning Back Clique, where each week here at MMA Junkie, we take a spin through the biggest stories in MMA. I'm your host, Gorgeous George, and with me, as always, some of the sharpest MMA minds in the biz. Joining me this week goes from MMA Junkie Radio. He's back after a rare week off. Farah Hanoun checks in from the other side of the world. Good to have her back. Nolan King is back as well. Always great to have him on SBC. And Kamikaze will work the ones and twos. Let's get to it. All right, so big news came down this past Saturday as Ciryl Gane and Jon Jones will headline UFC 285. And guess what? It's for the vacant UFC heavyweight title. You can imagine what topic number 2 is right about now, huh? Anyway, look, this is a huge fight involving the former interim heavyweight champ and arguably the GOAT of MMA. We should be pumped, no? Early odds on this fight have Gane as the favorite at minus 120, with Jones as the underdog at plus 100, according to Best Fight Odds. What is your reaction to this fight booking? And as I always do, I like to push you guys a little bit. Give me that early lean. Turning to the Junkie Radio veteran for the first take goes. What say you?
Well, it was a little difficult for me because we waited 3 years for this guy to come back, right? I had other visions in my mind when we would get to this moment that we'd be talking about other things. For starters, I thought this fight would be at Allegiant Stadium. I mean, if we can't fill that with Jon Jones, one of the best to ever do it, I think the only shot we have is maybe with Conor McGregor, right, at that point. So that was a little bit of a letdown. But I'll tell you this much, man. The matchup with Ciryl Gane, it may not be as sexy, but I think it'll actually turn out to be a good fight. It just feels like a little bit of a letdown because of some of the names on this show that we've thrown around that didn't end up in the mix. That was a little sad. But for Jon Jones, I'll tell you what, I think this is a tough matchup for him. You know, I may be in the minority in this one, but I think when you lay down the tactics, what's going on, a 3-year layoff, that's going to be difficult to contend with. You have Ciryl Gane, who's very good tactical. Like that guy, he'll sit back in the pocket. He doesn't care if people boo at him. That doesn't bother him one bit. And you have to understand that Jon Jones is in a position where he probably wants to come back and be a wrecking force, right? Make a statement. I think what he needed was a guy that was going to be a little bit more reckless, which you might have gotten a little bit with Francis Ngannou. Somebody that was going to come forward because he's so good at making you pay for your mistakes. Jon Jones is going to have his hands full with this fight, man. I think Ciryl Gane. If you're going to make me take an early lean, George, I'm going to go Ciryl Gane. But as far as the announcement goes, it just lacked a little bit of oomph that we thought we were going to get when we said Jon Jones is back.
Yeah, and it didn't help that someone at T-Mobile was tripping. They put that thing up early, kind of ruined it. You know what I mean? All right, Fada, next to you, your reaction, and give me that early lean.
Yeah, exactly. You said it. I mean, when they leaked it, it kind of like I was very surprised to see it, obviously, but I think it would have been a lot more exciting if we saw it in the broadcast or if that's when they were planning on announcing it. But yeah, listen, it's not the matchup we expected. Of course, we were anticipating Jon Jones's return for so long. We were linking him to Stipe, and Francis Ngannou was those two. Nobody really thought of Ciryl Gane as an option. We matchmaked him against Ciryl and Curtis Blades and whatnot, but I think people were thinking either Stipe Miocic or Francis Ngannou. So to see that it was Gane, it's very surprising, but I don't hate it. I agree with Goz. I think this is a potentially his toughest test, especially coming off of that layoff, because for me personally, it's hard to bet against Ciryl Gane. I know he just lost or the fight before to Francis Ngannou, but generally speaking, I'm not surprised to see him as a favorite, and I will lean towards Ciryl Gane just because he's a tough puzzle to solve. Now, everybody's looking at the wrestling, right? They think that after he lost to Francis Ngannou, there could be a chink in his armor. And I remember I talked to Ciryl after his loss to Francis Ngannou before he fought Tai Tuivasa, and I asked him about that. I said, what do you think of people starting to critique? Because he's kind of been a perfect fighter, right? Unbeaten. He always says, you know, his game plan is to touch and not be touched. And then we saw against Francis Ngannou, it was a close fight. Hey, look, he was having success on the feet. Of course, Francis came in with an injured knee, but, you know, Ciryl Gane on the feet is a handful to deal with for anybody, including Francis. I believe so, even if he was healthy. Now, obviously, Francis has the ultimate equalizer. But when talking about Jon Jones, all those attributes that Jon Jones usually has the advantage, now he's fighting a guy that kind of matches him in that regard in terms of the speed, the footwork, the movement, because Ciryl kind of moves like a middleweight. The grappling is the big question here. Of course, Jon Jones training with Henry Cejudo. We all know how much Henry Cejudo loves wrestling. He tries to implement. We saw the advancements that Zhang Weili made in her game when she worked with Henry Cejudo. So you can bet that Jon Jones will be looking, at least Henry Cejudo will be telling him to wrestle. But when I asked Ciryl about his wrestling and kind of the criticism, he was like, listen, my wrestling's not bad. He's like, I know I have some work to do, but I can wrestle. I don't want to say he took offense to it. I mean, he said it in the most bon gamin way possible, but he didn't seem to like it too much that people were critiquing his wrestling. And it was a year ago. I'm sure he's worked on it. So it'll be a very interesting fight for sure.
Great stuff from Fada. And I don't know what's cooler, hearing Danny Segura say Yoel Romero or Fada pronouncing Ciryl Gane's name the way it's supposed to be pronounced. Nolan, take it over.
Yeah, I can't do either of those, so sorry to disappoint. I'm just going to lead with that. No, I mean, I think that this fight, it's bottom line is that we were on here week after week after week talking about Jon and when he'll come back and if he'll come back, and it was exhausting. So to actually have a booking to see the poster on the side of the building or on Twitter a couple hours later when the official announcement came was very refreshing to see, and it was a bit surreal. Like I said, no pun intended. To me, this is a great fight. I think that if you separate it from what we're going to talk about in a bit with Francis, I think that the priority here, one of them obviously from the start, has been trying to book Jon. Jon has been ready. Jon has been on good terms with the UFC. They came to a new agreement. Those are things that I think were a massive hurdle to get, for the UFC to get done. So the fact that those were done, then you needed to book him, right? And if Stipe wasn't ready, which he wasn't, Francis obviously is doing his thing, has separated from the company. This is the next best option. And I think, honestly, the fact that they couldn't get something done and the fact that it was dragged out for so long, I mean, they started to try to book this fight in November to have Jon fight somebody. That ended up helping Ciryl, where he was, a couple months ago, he was considered injured. The UFC was not looking at him as a potential option for this date because they were trying to book a fight for Jon then and there. That's when that kind of Curtis Blades talk came through. But Ciryl was in consideration at that time. He was just dealing with the injury. So I think the stars have really aligned for him, and people are overlooking him just because of the storylines that are going on here. I mean, Francis and Jon are two of the biggest stars in the sport. They deserve the shine. They deserve the talk. But it almost makes me think like people are sleeping too hard on Gane. I mean, the guy has been really stellar outside of the Francis fight where he was wrestled. And obviously, I'm sure Jon will try to go to those roots for, in this fight as well. But this is an intriguing matchup, and who knows how Jon's going to look with all this time out at a new weight class. I think we know what we're getting into with Ciryl Gane, and that's a really damn good fighter.
Yeah, and people are getting excited about it already. Look at me, Diamond 44 in the chat room is saying Jones versus Stipe wasn't all that interesting. Gane is much more intriguing. I think a lot of people feel that way, and it's kind of weird to say that because, I think Stipe still can boast having the best credentials of a heavyweight ever. But yeah, he just hasn't been around lately, and that last fight, just looked awful. But anyhow, I wish I could. I mean, I'm pumped, and as we get closer, I'll be more pumped. But it's accompanied by some other news, and we're moving to topic 2. As mentioned, Gane versus Jones will compete for the vacant UFC heavyweight title. That's because Ngannou is no longer on the UFC roster. And Ngannou was, they parted ways, we can say, after a contract dispute with the promotion. UFC president stated, quote, "We've been negotiating with Ngannou for more than 2 years. We offered Francis a deal that would have made him the highest paid heavyweight in the history of the company, more than Lesnar, more than anybody, and he turned the deal down. This is shocking, in my opinion. Think about it. They parted ways with their heavyweight champion, the baddest man on the planet. Give me your thoughts on this massive news. Fada, it's your turn."
Yeah, I'm very disappointed, to be honest. I'm disappointed just with the way everything ended with Francis Ngannou. I mean, he comes in to that Ciryl Gane fight feeling a little disrespected. He comes in with an injury. He pulls through, goes through so much adversity, and tries to get a deal going in the UFC. Now, we don't know the full story, right? I mean, Dana said something about him being doesn't want to fight or wants to go somewhere else to fight lesser competition. Obviously, I don't think that's the case. I mean, Francis has fought everybody they put in front of him in the UFC, and I think it's more the opposite, right? People are usually scared to fight Francis rather than him being scared to fight. I don't think that's the reason. I think it comes down to the boxing thing. He seemed dead set on wanting boxing to be part of his contract, and Francis strikes me as a guy that sticks by his guns. He kind of has all the kind of interviews that he had done leading up to his negotiations and stuff like that, he was talking about the boxing thing, and it didn't seem like he wanted to accept an offer without boxing involved. So I don't know if it's just, we don't even know how much he was offered, and I don't know if we will find out, but I'd love to hear from Francis. But I think boxing has a lot to do with it because he was very keen. And if the Tyson Fury boxing match is on the table, we saw them face off at an event before, if that's on the table, it's hard to believe that he want to not capitalize on that, right? Because how many opportunities are you going to get to have a mega fight like that and make that much money? So I think it has a lot to do with the boxing. But again, I'd love to hear from Francis. I doubt it has anything to do with lesser competition and stuff like that. It's just a shame because he could have emerged as a massive, massive star for the UFC. He was trending towards that direction. And unfortunately, I'm not saying it's the end in terms of his stardom, but I would have liked to see that continue. But again, like to hear from Francis and see, what really went on from his side.
Yeah, it just seems like such a knee-jerk reaction. Just like, that's it, he's cut. Nothing, not even the threat of an interim to maybe let him quake in his boots for 3 months to see if maybe he comes around. Gone, just like that. Gone. I mean, a monster, the baddest man on the planet. How do you part ways with him? I don't get that. And you got that perfect, that quote, Fada. It was fight lesser competition for more money. That's what White says, what was implying that his exit was motivated by. Nolan, what do you think about all this, man? You have to be just as disappointed as I am.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but it's interesting to hear Dana's comments there where he says that Francis wants more money to fight lesser competition. To me, that sounds like an interesting spin on a guy trying to get his value. You know what I mean? Like, if he thinks that the biggest fish, he probably thinks, Francis, that the biggest fish to fry are in the UFC, and he probably wants to be paid more because of that. And obviously, we don't know all the X's and O's and ins and outs and what went on behind the scenes. But to me, I hope that it is the boxing route. I just think, sure, Francis can get his paydays. I'm sure PFL could shell up. Any of these companies, right, I think could shell up the money. It's just a matter of, is the juice worth the squeeze? And when it comes to the heavyweight champion of the world, the best heavyweight on the planet, if Bellator or PFL were to pick him up, I mean, that's a huge feather in their cap. That's an attraction. You know what I mean? But I think from a fan's perspective, I think that who is he going to fight in those promotions, right? I mean, you can have Francis Ngannou, murder hour every week where he destroys a PFL heavyweight or a Bellator heavyweight. But to me, I think the intrigue and the money here is probably in boxing for Francis. So I hopefully he does have an advantage being a heavyweight. I think that sells those sort of fights more than, if somebody from the UFC tried to jump over and fight Canelo or something. I think it doesn't necessarily have that same allure that the heavyweights do, because we know Francis has the power. We know it only takes one punch. I think him and Tyson Fury, that's like a perfect, kind of yin and yang, so to speak, to promote a fight. It would probably do some things for Fury as well. I think he would like to kind of be in sort of a sideshow attraction fight like the Mayweather-McGregor fight was, sort of that sort of level and whatnot. So to me, hopefully it's boxing. I think that's the move. I think that's the play for all involved. I think that's a play for the fans. And then we'll see what happens from there on out. Maybe he will go to MMA. Maybe it is worth his time to just go cash those paychecks and fight guys that are maybe not to some of the caliber of the UFC title contenders that he would fight had he stuck around in the promotion. But certainly an interesting time for MMA. What a time for these two storylines to cross too, right here in the middle.
Yeah, it's got to be the boxing money because he ain't scared of anybody. Michael Joel says Dana lied. Ngannou did not leave because he's scared of losing to Jones. How can Ngannou be scared? That's rubbish. He may not have said that exactly, but yeah, the implication is pretty much correct. This dude ain't scared of anyone. He's already fought some of the killers, that the UFC's had to offer. Former champions, K1 champions, like literally everyone, and he's iced them, a lot of them in the first round. He ain't scared. Goes, how about you?
Yeah, I gotta agree. That guy ain't afraid of nothing. Like, I don't think Francis Ngannou lacks a passion for mixed martial arts. I just think he realizes the dangers that come along with prize fighting. And I think he's smart enough to maximize his income with taking the same amount of risk, right? I think it's all about getting control of your own life, your own career, getting that back from the UFC. He's already accomplished the highest feat you could do in mixed martial arts. So I think that part of his soul is satisfied right now. It's about testing himself in boxing. And as Nolan alluded to, this has a different feel than what we all felt like when we saw Floyd Mayweather fight Conor McGregor, right? Floyd Mayweather is arguably one of the greatest boxers that ever lived, right? But on the other side, Conor McGregor was just a very good fighter, a talented fighter. On this side, you can actually promote the baddest man in MMA against the baddest man in boxing. That's going to translate into more pay-per-view buys. There's just no way around it. So something like that could be really lucrative for him. To go to your point, George, so what you were talking about was why wasn't there a little bit of period where he just stuck around and matching? I think at the end of the day, this is all going to work out for everyone, because I think what the UFC's figured out is, look, let's let him go do his thing, because he doesn't really have that much of a life in boxing. Let's keep it real. The creme de la creme in boxing, I have a feeling they're probably going to have their way with him. That's just the way it is. That's a completely different sport. Mm-hmm. He does present power, and I get that, but Tyson Fury's been hit with a lot of punches. He got up like the Undertaker, right? He didn't care. He comes forward. So I don't know, like, if he loses to Tyson Fury, I think that's done, and he comes back to MMA. We've seen a lot of heavyweight champions leave the UFC and come back. It's happened plenty of times, and I think the UFC is saying, let's let him get that out of the way, and then he comes back. If Jon Jones can kind of recapture what he did at light heavyweight, do that at heavyweight, well, he's going to need heads, right? He's going to need people to fight, people that are interesting, and this fight can be just as big further down the road, right? But Francis Ngannou can cash that big paycheck. It's an important thing that I think he wants to do in his life, gain some control. Tyson Fury, what did he make, like $40 million for his last fight? And I think he gets like 40 to 50% of the cuts in the pay-per-view. That's like a different world over there in boxing, the amount of money you can make. I'm not saying that Francis Ngannou can't make that in mixed martial arts. He probably can, but it's going to be over a period of time. And guess what? You got to keep winning. If you stop winning, you are no longer the UFC's favorite fighter, right? You go back to the guy that was causing problems months ago, and nobody holds a grudge like the UFC. So I think Francis Ngannou and the UFC eventually will get what they want, but it's going to have to wait.
That is true. A lot of champions have gone away and come back. Mark Coleman did it. He went to Japan and came back. Randy Couture did it a few times, Japan and came back, or, other promotions. As you were talking, I was thinking about Josh Barnett was a champ, got stripped, and then eventually came back. Andrei Arlovski, he went to one championship, WSOF, and he's been back. He's been back for a minute. He's been around for a minute. There's one other one, too, that I could – Fabricio Verdum, they cut him. He wasn't champ yet, but then he came back and became champ. So, yeah, let's cross our fingers, man, that he can come back after he grabs a bag from boxing Tyson Fury. But I'm just so disappointed that the baddest man on the planet is no longer on the roster. Anyway, Sky Beats and El Daddy says, hearing about Francis's story, yes, his dream was always the box. So he's fulfilling his dream, according to Sky Beason. Go ahead, Goes.
In a way, it kind of sucks for our sport, too, because it's not the best look when your greatest fighters just decide to go away, right? Like that they can't keep them on the roster. Kind of says a little bit of something about like where our sport is right now. But at the same time, I mean, think about it. If they're offering him that kind of money, where he's the highest paid heavyweight of all time, we all know how much money Brock Lesnar made. That's got to be a lot of coin. But at the same time, it's got to be worth it for the UFC, right? Like Francis Ngannou's coming off an injury. What if he loses? What if he gets injured again? Then what do you have? So I honestly think like both sides present good cases.
Yeah. All right. We can come back to this if you guys want. This is huge, but we got to move on. Let's move on to topic number 3. UFC President Dana White made a cameo during the UFC Fight Night Media Day. White had yet to face the MMA media about the unfortunate events that took place on New Year's Eve when he was caught on video slapping his wife. He fielded questions for almost 14 minutes, and one thing is clear, he will not face any punishment over his actions. Here's one quote that stood out. The entire video, by the way, is available at youtube.com/MMA Junkie video, where many of you are watching. Click and subscribe. Anyway, the quote is, "Me leaving hurts the company, hurts my employees, hurts the fighters. It doesn't hurt me," end quote. His comments weren't well received by many on social media, fighters, celebrities, fans, many others, including a few pundits on ESPN, Stephen A. Smith and Molly Karam, to name a few, with Karam actually calling for UFC owners' endeavor to punish White. Nolan, you're leading things off.
Yeah, obviously a bit messy all around. And I think that, there was some good stuff to come out of him speaking. I think there was more questions than answers in some departments. I think there were some very questionable, untrue, or twisted ways of thinking that came out of that press conference. For me, for a guy, first of all, him going up there and facing the music a bit, you got to give him props for that. But beyond that, I would say a lot of what he said seemed like, didn't seem like he shouldn't, the person that's doing a punishment, the person that did something wrong, also serving as the judge for their own punishment seems like a very odd sort of scenario. I mean, how many businesses would put somebody like that in a position to do something like that? I think it's a very strange sort of presentation. I think a lot of the blame currently should fall on Endeavor for not saying anything about this still. I think that's where a lot of the kind of the criticism should fall right now. I think Dana got up there, he took questions, he answered them with questions. Sometimes he kind of indicated, that the company would suffer if he were to get punished somehow, which is a very, I think, odd sort of way of thinking and kind of untrue. And again, if you compared this to other businesses, I mean, does that fly? I don't really think so. And so for him to kind of flip it as like, oh, the punishment was that, I did it, or I raised awareness through doing it. Those sort of things, to me, you come on, like, that's just some of the most ridiculous stuff I've ever heard in terms of try to relate that to anything else in life. Somebody gets arrested for something. Well, my name was in the paper. That's enough punishment. I'm going to have to live with this forever. I mean, that's just not the way that the world works in any other sort of context. So again, I'm not trying to take blame off Dana. I think some of the stuff that he said wasn't great, but I do think most of the criticism in terms of punishment and whatnot has to fall on Endeavor. I think the fact that they have not said anything, Ari Emanuel has not said anything, who is a champion a lot of times for, a lot of sort of social causes and whatnot, for him to kind of just, when it's him or when it's his company, just be like, I'm not going to really comment on this publicly. I thought it was weird. I thought the press conference was weird. Again, even though I do say, like, that it was a good thing that he got up there and took questions from the media, and he did tell the biggest good takeaway from the whole thing, biggest positive was him telling, in my opinion, telling people to stop defending him. I think he definitely didn't make excuses, which is a lot of times you hear people, even when they apologize for certain things, they kind of, well, but there was none of that. He didn't even mention alcohol this time, I don't think. Maybe he did, but it was not as prevalent as it was in that TMZ interview. But yeah, man, I think Endeavor's silence is still deafening, even in the even weeks out from it.
I agree. I think a lot of this sits with Endeavor. Nolan, you nailed it. Molly Karam nailed it. Goes, how about you? You gonna nail it?
Oh, we'll see. I mean, look, I thought the first 2 minutes of that was pretty good. I love the part about him saying people shouldn't come defend him. He's right. And I love the part that where he owned the criticism coming his way, and he deserves it, right? But from there, it did kind of go downhill. Don't ask us what we think the punishment should be. That's not for us to decide. You're just deflecting that question because you don't want to answer it, right? So stop doing that. Stop telling us that it's all about the employees and the UFC would suffer if you go away, because you spend a lot of time telling us that this is a well-oiled machine. So I don't really understand that argument. But most of all, the thing that really gets to me on this, guys, is you can't say walking around with this label is your punishment. That's not your punishment. That's a repercussion of what you did, okay? When Pete Rose had his scandal in MLB, his punishment was being banned, okay? It wasn't walking around being labeled as a cheater. Anybody that knows Pete Rose, he didn't really seem to care about that. Michael Vick's punishment wasn't being labeled a monster. It was going to prison, okay? That's a punishment. What your little label that you got to walk around with, that's a repercussion of what you did. And you have to you got to get that straight before you go out in front of the media. Like, I applaud him for getting up there, and I get that sitting in my chair, it's easy to say, you should have said this, should have done that. I'm not saying if I was in his position, I would be perfect at everything I was going to say, but I'll tell you this, that's why I'm not there. That's why I think he needs to step away. He needs to be away, because right now, unless you're going to be perfect in front of those cameras and say all the right things, you have no business being there. You're a distraction right now. Okay. When people ask you, like, what do you regret the most? You don't say going out on New Year's Eve. That's not the problem. The only thing that should come out of your mouth is not slapping my wife. Okay. I should have never done that. That's the only thing you should be saying. To me, all this is kind of a distraction. He doesn't really need to be there right now. I'm not saying never come back. I'm just saying go away for a while. Go away for a while. Make it feel like this means something. But for right now, you're just a distraction here.
Well said, Goes. Fada, let's turn to you.
I think the UFC's motto has always been the show must go on. We've seen it with Francis Ngannou, but in this case, it can't be, right? I think it's alarming. I think it falls back to Endeavor in the UFC, like just no statement being released. I think that was the biggest issue. Yes, I mean, kudos to Dana for facing the media. And you know what? He's going to continue to get asked about it every single week, because regardless of certain reporters have asked him, others will. He's going to get asked about it every single week. But the idea is here that there has been no official kind of statement, whether Endeavor, the UFC, and then now Power Slap, or is that Power Slap, the fighting league, is going to, it took like a brief pause and now it's going to continue like nothing happened. I think this is where the problems lie. I think it's the higher ups. I think it's Endeavor. I think it's the UFC, the lack of statement, just kind of like the mentality of with time, everyone will forget kind of thing. And I think that's obviously not going to be the case, because we're continuously talking about it, because it is a serious topic. And I know a lot of people are getting fed up and get over it and whatnot. And I'm seeing a lot of that. But the thing is, the reason why we keep asking Dana about it and why he will continue to be asked about it is because Endeavor, UFC, no statement has been released, no kind of punishment, if you want to call that, has been made, which is why it's not, the idea of it fading over time is not going to happen, in my opinion, just because it's odd. Whether it was the NBA, NFL, we would have seen action and much more serious action being taken right away. I think in this case, it's just, for the first time to hear about it being a TMZ interview that Dana did. Again, I do think he deserves credit. Dana does deserve credit for continuing to address it, but it's all kind of falling on him and him asking us what we think his punishment should be, when in fact it should be the higher ups, UFC, Endeavor, Ari, whatnot, that are making the decisions, whether the Power Slap Fighting League to be postpone it for a while. Don't have to, postpone it for a week or whatnot. It's just the timing is weird. It's ironic, of course. So I just think it falls down to the higher ups taking action. The hesitancy to take action, if they're gonna take action even, is what has made this weird. And the more time passes, I think the mentality is, well, we haven't taken action, we probably won't. Dana says they won't. So the mentality is, over time, people are going to forget. And I don't think they will. And I think he'll continue to be asked about it. And I think it just should have been handled in a completely different way, right on the spot, instead of relying on time healing the wound, so to speak.
Yeah. And, your company has to stand for something. You right now are basically saying that this maybe will be tolerated depending on the case-by-case basis. And what he's saying isn't being matched by the actions. This should not be tolerated by anyone in that company, including his fighters who are independent contractors, any of the 400 employees that work for the UFC across the world. And it hasn't been tolerated in the past. And then there's been times when it's been tolerated. It's just this whole mixed bag. The code of conduct that they've come up with is so selective. And I don't know. I just think it takes away from the integrity of the company and what you stand for. You have to stand for something. He's also saying, Jack P in the chat is saying she slapped him first. Stop with that. Even Dana said it. Stop with that. It's never okay to put your hands on a woman. So the whole self-defense thing or anything having to do with that, just stop with it. He doesn't want you to white knight for him, so don't white knight for him. It's unfortunate, but yeah, it's probably going to keep coming back because it's been poorly handled. But we got to move on to topic number 4. Bellator announced its next Grand Prix. This time, 8 lightweight fighters will compete for a belt, a milli, and of course, the undisputed belt will be on the line as the tournament unfolds. The participants include champion Usman Nurmagomedov, Benson Henderson, Tofik Musayev, Alexander Shabili, Mansour Barnaoui, Sidney Outlaw, AJ McKee, and Patricky Frady. I know I butchered 3 of those names. Fada, give me a lesson later. As you can see, we have those matchups and a couple of the dates. Bendo looks like he gets a first crack at the champion's title. Huge fight for him. McKee can't seem to get away from the Pitbull brothers. Those are the first couple things that did jump out at me. Anyway, count me in. I love these Grand Prix. Let's get the thoughts from the panel. Goes, it's back on you.
I think at first glance, I wasn't too happy. Upon further review, I'm okay with it. I think what this tournament really needed, this Grand Prix, was some new blood, right? Like, we spend a lot of time in this Bellator bubble with kind of the same names, and I wanted something that makes it feel a little different, right? There's a couple free agents out there that possibly, who knows, maybe they did speak to him and things didn't work out. But I would say a name like Anthony Pettis, a name like Eddie Alvarez, that could have maybe spiced things up a little bit. You got to remember, guys, we are getting bombarded in mixed martial arts for our time. The UFC asks for a lot of time. PFL asks for a lot of time. Bellator, BKFC. And if you grew up a sports fan like us, I mean, there's other things that we have to do. So if you're going to ask for our time, you got to make us feel like we're watching something different. And that would probably be my only gripe with this Grand Prix is, a lot of the same faces. I just wanted to see something a little bit different to get my appetite going. But at the end of the day, I think some of the matchups will create some fun fights that we're going to be talking about. But I think it could have been a little bit more spicier.
I felt the same way. Those names, I don't know. I'm just not as familiar with some of them, to tell you the truth. But the champ defends along the way. They give them each $1 million. They definitely have stepped it up from other Grand Prix in the history of our sport. Fada, what'd you think?
I think just Usman Nurmagomedov being a champion, that adds excitement, obviously because of his family name. And of course, because of the general criticism that anyone associated with Khabib, whether related to him or at his gym, get in terms of level of competition. These guys don't fight. They get a fast route. This isn't that. And then obviously you have the counter argument of, well, nobody accepts to fight them. Well, that's the beauty of this Grand Prix, because you have to fight everybody, right? Of course, certain people are going to come out of those matchups. But for Usman to, at this point in his career, to go through a Grand Prix and have to go through those fights. Now, I'm not saying he might get the toughest route, because of course we could get some upsets and whatnot, but I think it's exciting. And I love the addition of AJ McKee as well at lightweight. I think he's going to bring, obviously for his name, he just signed a new deal with Bellator. Obviously with his name being one of the biggest stars in their promotion, we would love to see that Usman versus AJ McKee final, or maybe not even in the final beforehand. But I think just the lure of having Usman being the defending champion and having the addition of AJ McKee makes it exciting enough for me personally.
Yeah, and I probably should have included that. AJ McKee has re-signed with Bellator, so that was huge for Bellator to keep one of their biggest stars on the roster. And yes, he's included here in this tournament. It does look like an opposite bracket type of thing. Nolan, what do you think, man? You're pretty close to the Bellator promotion. You cover for it, the events for MMA Junkie, so you've seen a lot of these guys.
Yeah, it's nice to have a more level-headed take from Farah after goes. Talking about new blood, we got multiple guys in this tournament that have only had one fight in Bellator, and I think have been some of their best free agent signings in recent years. For some reason, the UFC slept on Taufik Musayev and Mansour as well, and both of those guys were killers in their respective regions of the world where they dominated. Mansour is out in Korea. Taufik obviously doing his thing in Ryzen. Both those guys are seriously good fighters, as is Alexander Chablis, who's another dark horse in this tournament. I think for what this is, PFL is known for its tournaments. That's their whole thing, right? The season, they got the tournament at the end. But I think when Bellator does this is the best tournament that we have in MMA right now, because I think every fight matters. There's a belt on the line throughout the tournament. And then also that it's the top 8 or so guys in that division. I mean, there's no kind of dark horse sort of weird free agents that they bring in from somewhere in the world that you don't know how good they are, and then they get iced by Kayla Harrison or something. That's not what we're doing here. We're doing, legitimately the 8 top guys in that division. Like Farah said, there's no running, there's no hiding, there's no arguing about who your next opponent is going to be. Everybody's stepped up. They've agreed to this, and I think this tournament's great. Usman's the champ. You got, kind of a fresh face with the belt. You got AJ McKee in the lightweight division. You got the name recognition of yesteryear in Benson Henderson. And then you got all these free agents that I mentioned that I think, for whatever reason, the UFC passed on. All 3 of those guys that I named are exciting. They're really high potential ceilings, and I could see any of them winning, and I wouldn't be shocked.
Let me ask you guys this, though. Could they have used a little bit of pop? You know how Eddie Alvarez is just kind of hanging out there? What if they would have brought him back? Like, I think that would have, added something. In addition to re-signing AJ McKee and the champ defends, and Benson's a former champ, and a couple of these young cats you never heard of, Eddie Alvarez is back. What do you think?
And I took a jab at Go's kind of more fooling around there, but that is the dilemma with Bellator right now, right? I mean, they moved away from a model that was bringing in fans from name recognition, and I think people criticized them at the time as having the, ex-UFC champs, ex-UFC contenders washing up, and they end up in Bellator, and they didn't like that. So they went out and they signed guys that should have been in the UFC. They could be in the top 15 in the UFC, but then they end up taking the hit because people tune in. They're like, I don't know who these people are. I've never heard of this guy. I've never heard this guy from, Tajikistan or somebody that was from France that fought in Korea for the last 8 years. They don't know how good these people are. So it's a double-edged sword. it's the dilemma that I think Bellator is having as an organization, just with their whole image, right? They're putting on, in my opinion, the best top to bottom cards that they've ever put on. And I also feel like at the same time, the buzz is not there that it was 2-3 years ago. So you got to weigh it, right? You got to weigh the good with the bad. I know we've talked about Showtime and how much that impacts people's watchability, but a guy like Eddie Alvarez, you nailed it. That would bring in at least that buzz factor. And he can compete with those guys. Eddie's game, he's exciting. So yes, I agree. Somebody like Eddie coming in and maybe Sydney Outlaw sitting out, that would have made it a little bit more ideal.
Yeah. What I like is that the goal is always to get it done within a year, which means the champion's going to defend 3 times in a year if he makes it that far. Keeps the belt moving. So they're exciting. Sometimes they do drag on. I realize COVID blew a couple of them out of the water, but if it can be executed, like Scott Coker said, and you already saw on that graphic, 2 of the quarterfinals will take place on March 10th in San Jose. I believe another one's headed to Paris, France. One is still yet to be determined, but hopefully they can get this thing all resolved. The champions, he's not holding the belt hostage or anything while everyone else is competing. He's a part of it. So the Grand Prix really ticks a lot of boxes for me if executed perfectly, but we'll see.
But it's got to pop, though. That's the thing, right? Like these names that some people don't know, that'll work on a Bellator card, but on a Grand Prix where it has to stand out over everyone else, it's got to pop. And I think that's where you need that one little extra name. At the end of the day, it might end up being good, but I don't know that casual fan's going to see that listing and go, I can't miss this. And that's what a Grand Prix has to be.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was very intentional. Go for it, Fair.
No, go for it. I'll go.
I was going to say, I think there was very intentional matchmaking in the first round too, putting Benson against, having him get the title shot, and then also doing Patricky versus AJ that kind of has that heat rivalry. I think that's a way that Bellator specifically, like we've seen in the past, I think for one of the tournaments, they literally went by the rankings, like 1 versus 8 and 2 versus 7. So for this one, I think that some of these matchups were made with the intention of sucking people in off the bat with familiarity.
Yeah, that literally goes to my point. So I'm glad I let him go first. And having Mansour Bernawi also fight in Paris as well, I think they've done a good job in terms of the matchmaking with obviously Patricky and AJ, the rivalry between AJ and Patricio, and then having Mansour fight in Paris, and then having Benson Henderson, a notable name to most MMA fans, fight Usman. So I think the way they matchmake it as well is good because there's kind of a way to promote every one of them.
Darius in the chat says Bellator is stepping it up. They are good fighters, but casuals need to see that. All right. Good stuff from Darius there. Let's move on to topic number 5. UFC 286, that card in London, just got a nice boost. The main event and the co-main event are set, signed, and delivered. Edwards versus Usman 3 is officially going down. And how about this one? Justin Gaethje versus Rafael Fiziev. They get down right before the title fight. Hard not to co-sign on these two, right? Or do you disagree? I doubt it. Farah, go. It's your turn.
No, of course I don't. I mean, if I could start with the co-main event, any Justin Gaethje fight is exciting. And I know Fiziev, when he was calling him out, I was trying to kind of accuse him of ducking him. Gaethje had no surgery. But Gaethje's never in a boring fight. And Fiziev is one of the most exciting prospects in the sport. It's a perfect fight to make. Fiziev gets past a guy like Justin Gaethje, former interim champ. He's got a wealth of experience that's going to kind of skyrocket his career and give fresh blood in a very stacked lightweight division. And then for Gaethje, he gets to prove that he's still one of the top dogs because beating a guy like Fiziev is a big deal as well. And then in terms of the main event, it makes sense. Not only because Kamaru was winning that fight, but Kamaru is a guy who's defended his title multiple times. We've seen guys get, well, in this case, it's a trilogy, but a rematch in terms of the title fights for much less. I remember we saw with Cody and TJ, obviously because of their rivalry and the history was an easy buildup, but Cody hadn't even defended his belt yet, and he got an immediate rematch against TJ Dillashaw. In this case, Kamaru absolutely deserves it just based off his accolades. He was trending towards trying to get real close to George St. Pierre is the greatest welterweight of all time. Nobody was. Tyron Woodley was briefly in that conversation. He was trying, but I think Usman had done a little bit more to get towards GSP. Still think GSP is the GOAT, FYI. But I think in that case he deserves that immediate fight. I love Bilal Muhammad. I think he's done amazing work at the welterweight division. Hamza Chimaev is their kind of middleweight welterweight. But I think in this case it makes perfect sense. Just the way the fight ended with that amazing head kick knockout. And it's the third time they fight, and there's the questions of the altitude. Did that have impact on Leon Edwards, the fact that they fought in Salt Lake City? So now he's on home soil. It's interesting. For me, I'm sold. I want to see the fight. So I think both fights are great.
Fod, are you covering the event for us?
I should be, yeah. So
Okay.
excited to see that, yeah.
So let me ask you something before I go to the guys. But first of all, we were hearing about a stadium show, early on, and then I think they found one in Cardiff where it might be closed up because of the weather, but stadium show, and that they were going to bring it with the card, and they are. These 1-2 main and co-main are awesome, but I look at the rest of the card and it's like, okay, like it's nice, but it's very, very top heavy, and sometimes that can be dangerous. I don't want to jinx the card and say what can happen, but you guys know. Don't you feel like it still needs a little bit more oomph?
Yeah, it does. I mean, there's also Vittoria and Dulce. They've got to put the local town, though, so I'm never against that. It's a good opportunity. The crowd is amazing. I mean, the London crowd, the UK crowd in general is one of the best. So I like to see them get the pop. So I like to see the Jai Herberts, the Lerone Murphys on the card. I think those guys are necessary. But I agree with you. Just one more fight, I feel like. One more main card fight of top-ranked contenders, whoever it may be. Then I think the card will be good. But hopefully, we never know. Maybe we'll get one. Because now, no Paddy. It seems like he's going to undergo ankle surgery in March. No Molly McCann, it appears. So those are the two that kind of would get the UK crowd really rowdy. But I still think there's room for one more big fight. Well, let's see.
I was hoping Aspinall would be healthy by then. I know he mentioned something.
Yeah. I recently wrote up an article on that. It's risky. It's not worth it. He's a guy that has a lot of promise in the heavyweight division, and especially that it's going to shape up quite nicely by the time he comes back. There's no need for him to rush. He's so young. For a heavyweight, he's ridiculously young. So there's no need for him to rush.
All right, Nolan, you know what I'm talking about, right, man? They keep lifting that pay-per-view price. We're up to $80. So when it's $80, come on, I need this card to jump at me, not me go digging for it.
Yeah, and especially considering that there's 2 pay-per-views in the span of 3 weeks, too. I mean, that's a lot of dough for UFC fans to have to dish out for 10 fights. But all things considered, I think for a pay-per-view based in, a European-based pay-per-view, this is obviously a pretty good lineup. This might be the shortest segment in SBC history, just because I don't think there's really much to really comment on when it comes to Justin Gaethje or Rafael Fiziev. We know what those guys are bringing. We know what kind of fight we're in for. We know which one everyone's circling when they pull up the bout sheet to look at UFC 286's lineup. And then the main event is a trilogy that sells itself. I mean, good 1-2 punch there. Like you said, maybe another supporting act will be nice, but a pretty nice card. And I'm happy for all the people out there to actually get a pay-per-view for once and not be able to not get another fight night. You know what I mean? I think just having that big fight feel and feeling important and having the lineup with all fighters from the region is always a great thing. We haven't necessarily seen that as much during the pandemic era, but it seems like this one's crafted towards that fan base, which is great. So good for all the people out there. I'm sure it'll be a pretty good night of fights.
The fans in London usually help you make you feel better. Anyway, as the night's progressing and the alcohol is being consumed, they really do make every event feel special. So shout out to the UK fans, especially the ones in London. All right, goes finish up.
The alcohol is not just being consumed at night, my friend. Trust me, that day starts early for them. That Fiziev Gaethje fight, dude. The storylines on this card are great. That's going to be a banger, and it's a win-win for the UFC, right? Like, does Gaethje remind us all that he's a badass, or is he going to pass the torch? Win-win for the UFC. And then the storyline behind the main event, I mean, it's a fight we needed to see. We know conditioning-wise, both guys are going to be there. It just comes down to where they're at mentally, I think. Yes, Leon Edwards won the last fight, but what's his mindset? Because he knows up until that moment he was getting dominated. Right? How does he feel on the inside? Does he believe that he can do this? I don't know, man. I mean, it took his corner screaming and yelling to get that out of him in that last fight. So it's going to be real interesting to see where these guys are in their heads. Kamaru Usman, I mean, this is the first time that invincibility shield crumbled, right? We hear GSP talk about this all the time, the effect that Matt Serra fight had on him and how it got in his head. And we saw how he bounced back, right? And like Farah said, I think he's the GOAT as well. And I know Kamaru battles that on the side as well. So let's see how he can bounce back from all that. But I think the storylines for this card are incredible.
Goes, by the way, I was pointing out as I was downing the beers, the event's unfolding, and you kind of correctly pointed out that they get down a little early in the UK, and pints are being had with the eggs and bangers. But that made me laugh tremendously. We do have time for additionals, so let me throw a few more at you. Great job on the top 5 topics there, panel. So UFC Fight Night 217, it took place this past Saturday. It was the first card of the year. So I wanted to ask you guys, who made the biggest impact in your minds? Nolan, go ahead. It's on you.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me not to pick Dan Ige. I just think to see him bounce back and get that win in the fashion that he did against a guy like Damon Jackson, who was surging, it would be hard for me not to pick him. Obviously, somebody that I think people in the sport have a lot of respect for. He's somebody that has fought tough competition and had things not go his way. So to be able to go out there, have the co-main event slot, and put on a highlight reel knockout, I'm going to go with 50K, making good on his nickname. I think that was a big night for him.
Yeah, for sure. He had lost the 3 straight, and this is a big, big win for him. All right, next up is Fada. How about you, Fada? Who made the biggest impact for you?
Yeah, I'm going to have to go with Omar Nurmagomedov, just simply because I love when we see a highly touted prospect live up to the hype. There's nothing more exciting than it in this sport. And I think, obviously, I don't even know how big of a favorite he was, but it must have been huge betting lines. And I understand why. But the fact that he got to show off his hands as well. And Raoni Barcelos is a tough guy. So this was supposed to be arguably his toughest test on paper. And the fact that I know he seemed quite surprised with it, right? I didn't even see what happened. I had to see the replay. All of a sudden, I found Raoni out cold, and I had to wait until the replay, considering it is about 5, 6 a.m. when I watch these fights. But still, I didn't see that coming. I don't think Omar Nurmagomedov saw it coming. So it was nice to show for him to show that he's not just an elite grappler, that he can knock people out as well. He's dangerous with his striking as well. And I think we're seeing that with kind of the newer blood of their Nurmagomedov school. Islam knocking Charles Oliveira down before submitting him. And then Usman Nurmagomedov and now Omar Nurmagomedov. Just kind of like the new breed of that gym. And I think, he wants a quick turnaround on UFC 285. I think the UFC will give it to him. It's a question of who's he going to fight. He talks about nobody wanting to fight him, but I hope to see him against a ranked opponent there. Exciting stuff for him. He's definitely one of kind of the more interesting prospects in the sport. And like I said, it's always exciting when we see somebody live up to that hype, and I feel like he did.
Yeah. All right. How about you guys? Who had the biggest impact for you?
Ditto with Dan Ige. I really feel like that dude's really interesting. If you ever sit down and talk to him, the things that he says are very, very interesting. The way he talks about the sport and the mental side and what this weighed in on him. I think he's going to turn things around. But you know what? Roman Kapilov had a great performance as well. Puna Soriano is no joke. That's a tough kid. And to see him kind of just break him down little by little until he got exactly what he wanted, that's a tough thing to do, especially with a tough competitor like Puna, somebody that can hit as hard as Puna, right? When he finally took his best shot and just kind of shook it off and kept coming forward, I think that's when we all knew Puna's goose was cooked. But that great performances for both those guys.
Yeah, that kick to the liver, man, that was brutal. All right, in the chat room, let me see here. We have a Bill Henricks asking our thoughts on Charles Johnson. I'll give him a shout out because he was the first fight of the night. Sometimes they just get no love. It was a little scary there. I mean, he's a beast. Don't get me wrong. I really want to see more from him. He fought a guy coming off, I believe, a 2-year layoff, Jimmy Flick, who had come through Contender Series and then said, no, I'm good. He was back. Flick had a nice back take that I thought was scary for Johnson, but Johnson was very methodical and took it slow, went through his steps, I think, of processing the defense, and then came back and just put it on. Fight price was stopped a little early, but either way, the end was inevitable. So he was the one that made one of the biggest impacts. Hard not to also agree with you guys. Dan Ige, an Extreme Couture guy, huge win for him. Sean Strickland made up some money that he felt like he lost from his last fight. So I think his mood's going to be a lot different. That guy's so emotional. He supposedly got paid a nice hefty sum for the late notice. Didn't have to cut any weight and gets a win bonus. So I think he's in a happier mood, and he's going to be buying some new drones. All right, let's go to our last additional here since we have some time. UFC 283 takes place this Saturday. And quick reminder, Goz and I will be hosting a watch-along here on MMA Junkie Saturday, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Join us as we will watch the fights along with you guys. If you don't get the pay-per-view, we'll be your eyes and ears, and we'll tell you what's happening in real time. Fada Hanoun will be hosting the preview show at 5 Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific. So tune in on Saturday. We got you covered, MMA Junkie. We got you covered all week, but Saturdays, those UFC pay-per-views, yep, exactly. That's when we really, really bring it. All right, so what I want to know here is, it's the first pay-per-view of the year. There's 2 title fights at the top of the bill. We love them, right? But tell me, aside from those, include those if you want, what else are you looking forward to from this card in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil? This time we start off with Goes.
Dude, I mean, that's tough because really, for me, the one thing that's sticking out in this card is closing that chapter on this book. I really want this to be over with. But the only way to make that happen is to keep the judges out of it, right? And I think that's going to be a theme for this whole card, is really let the dog out in this fight. I think overall, this card, I think, is kind of sneaking under the radar. You know, I think a lot of us are looking forward, but I have a feeling that this card is going to produce a lot of good fights on it. But I'm telling you, let the dog come out in this fight. Let's end this Brandon Moreno and Davison Figueiredo. Let's get some new blood in here. That's what this card's all about for me, dude.
Okay, next up is Fada.
Well, I know answering the main event is a bit of an obvious choice, but for me, just because of it's not the fight we expected to see, right? I mean, we go from Yuri vacating to Magomed Ankalaev and Jan Blachowicz battling to a majority draw, and then the UFC jumping. I know they needed a main event for Rio, so it kind of worked out perfectly for them in that regard. But at the end of the day, Glover was supposed to be part of that title picture. But Glover against Jamal Hill, and I remember an interview that you guys did, George and Goes, with Jamal Hill. It was November 2021, where he said, "I have the best hands in the UFC." And I remember I wrote up that article, and my goodness, the criticism that he got after I wrote that headline. Everybody in the comment section was like, well, what is it? It was right after he lost to Paul Craig. So he lost by TKO, but it was kind of like a submission. His arm snapped, and then he finished him. But people were kind of criticizing him and saying, what is this guy on about? Like, this guy's overconfident, this and that. And then since then, he's knocked out Jimmy Crute, Johnny Walker, Thiago Santos, and here he is in the title fight. So I don't think people are laughing too much right now, and I don't think it's that ludicrous of a statement. Jamal Hill has hands, and he's dangerous. But so does Glover Teixeira. I think a lot of people, when they talk about Glover Teixeira, they talk about his grappling all the time. Yes, he's a phenomenal grappler, but the guy can box too. And I think a lot of his prior opponents have felt that as well. So I doubt Jamal Hill is going to be underestimating him. I know he's been training with Anthony Smith, who fought Glover Teixeira before. And Anthony Smith had success against Glover Teixeira before Teixeira completely turned things around. Teixeira is a veteran, and we saw him hurt and rock Yuri Prochazka on the feet. Now, granted, Yuri kind of gets tagged in all his fights, right? He's kind of wild with his striking and his defense. But at the end of the day, Glover Teixeira is not to be underestimated. I would have never imagined in Abu Dhabi that he was going to walk through Jan Blachowicz the way he did. So Glover is a dog. He's very well rounded. He can submit you. He can knock you out. He can take you down. It's going to be a very interesting fight. But again, don't sleep on Glover Teixeira's stand-up but at the same time, I wanted to highlight kind of that interview just because I remembered how much people were criticizing Jamal Hill. He's obviously extremely, extremely dangerous with his hands. And Anthony Smith said it, he doesn't think Glover could stand with Jamal Hill. It seems like that's their path to victory, of course.
That's awesome. And thanks for bringing that up. I'll have to go look at it. You said November of 2021?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to give that some retweets and give him some love because that's one hell of a comeback, man. After getting your arm mangled like he did, those names that you just reminded us of, that's quite a comeback for him. All right, how about you, Nolan? UFC 283, man. What's got you going?
Well, honestly, looking at the card top to bottom, I think maybe it's not the sexiest, biggest named card on paper in terms of name recognition, but I do think there's a lot of violence potential, which is obviously a big gauge for me. I mean, you got Paul Craig and Johnny Walker fighting each other. Come on, that's going to be weird. That's going to be hectic. People are going to be getting tagged left and right. I mean, you got Terrence McKinney on the prelims. You have Jailton Almeida finally getting to fight after a few canceled bookings. One of the under the radar up and comers, I think, in all the UFC. So I think that this is going to be full of surprises. I think people in terms of entertainment maybe are looking more towards John coming back or the card in London. But I think this has some potential to provide some interesting moments, some fun moments. I mean, you got Gilbert Burns and Neil Magny on there. The retirement fight of Shogun. I always like when fighters announce their retirement going into it. I think that kind of, A, they're more likely to stick to their word, and B, I think it makes it more of a special moment than somebody kind of having racing thoughts in the cage afterwards and saying something. So Kind of an underrated card, but I think it's going to be entertainment-wise, probably going to exceed some expectations, in my opinion.
Yeah, and with Craig and Walker, don't you guys see somebody walking out of the octagon just jacked up? Either someone's getting their arm mangled up or recovering from a wicked submission, or someone's getting KTFO'd.
Or actually, according to Paul Craig, he did a recent interview with James Lynch. He said, I'm going to show off my hands here. He said, I believe in my power and I'm going to show off my hands. So it's very interesting that he's going into a Johnny Walker fight with that mentality. We've seen Johnny Walker do some wrestling as well, so I don't know what to expect of that.
Yeah. Oh man, that's what I do love about that matchup. And yeah, great for pointing out that
it's like peak MMA for me. You know what I mean? That's sort of a matchup. Like, sure, it's cool to watch technique and whatnot, but when it comes down and we're 2 minutes in and there's 3 knockdowns or 4 knockdowns and a triangle attempt, come on. That's the one that's going to get me going.
The chat came through at the end. We had a few white knights that can't wait to give Dana White a lap dance if they ever meet him. But Chi Wu says, Izzy got a face tattoo. And then Lafayette says, good. Pajeda can then tag him on his new tattoo. So good stuff.
Well, I can jump in since the tattoo is in Arabic. Let me flex my Arabic for once since it's never needed here. But he put it says Tinin, which means dragon, and there's an anime reference. I can't help you. This is where I stop.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you so much again to the chat and of course our panel, Farah Hanoun, Nolan King, and Goes from MMA Junkie Radio, and of course Kamikaze putting it all together. His second nickname is Abs of Steel. And keep it locked on MMA Junkie throughout the week. This is Fight Week. UFC 283 is on Saturday, and we got lots of great coverage for you. Our guy, Cold Coffee, is headed to Rio de Janeiro to cover it live and in person. And one last reminder, Goes and I, along with Farah, we will bring you a lot of content on Saturday, including the watch along, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, and the preview show, 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific. So we'll see you on Saturday, and the rest of you, we'll see you on Monday next week for Spinning Back Clique, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. Everybody tell your friends, we're out of here. Go out and be a champion.